Long time no see. It seems like you've become quite famous and are making good money, aren't you? Hey, don't you think it's time to repay the debt of me giving birth to you? That's how my sister-in-law, who had vanished after dumping her blind niece on me and my husband, showed up upon seeing her niece's success. I only had a child because my ex-husband really wanted one, but he was the one who quickly abandoned us. Now, repay the favor of me feeding and keeping you alive back then. What an outrageous thing to say. I wanted to send my sister-in-law away immediately, but my niece thought her aunt's argument made sense and decided to live with her. I was worried and anxious, but wished for nothing but my niece's happiness as I sent her off. Yet 4 days later, my sister-in-law returned with a bruised face, furious. How can you live with such a rough kid? My niece, rough? What did she mean? My head was filled with questions after hearing my sister-in-law's side. But the worst of her days were just beginning. After graduating from college, I was transferred out of state due to a job relocation, leaving my hometown behind. Years later, I had a reunion with my college friends and reconnected with my now husband, a senior I had once admired. It felt like a return to my student days when we exchanged contact details. It turned out my husband was working at a different branch of the same company, and we grew closer, eventually marrying and starting a new chapter as a married couple. We both worked for a while, but when my husband was assigned a long-distance transfer, I decided to follow him and resigned from my job. With further transfers, I naturally became a homemaker. After several relocations, my husband was promoted, freeing us from constant moves. We were called to the headquarters and now live in a suburb near a city. Due to frequent transfers, we chose not to have children. Originally planning to dedicate my life to my career, marriage and homemaking were unplanned aspects of my life. So when my husband brought up having children, it wasn't much of a shock. Then one day, my sister-in-law appeared with my niece in tow. She had married and given birth to my niece years earlier. However, due to personality clashes, she was abandoned by her husband and divorced. At that time, we were living at the northernmost tip and couldn't support her, making my husband feel guilty and occasionally provide her with financial help. It wasn't that my husband was eager to help, rather it was my sister-in-law who kept asking him for money. At first, he generously helped thinking of my niece, but my sister-in-law never tried to work. Her constant requests for money were clearly relying on my husband's earnings, and he gradually lost patience, deciding to cut ties. Both my husband and my sister-in-law's parents had passed away, leaving no relatives to rely on. Although my husband initially responded to her needs, he grew increasingly frustrated as her attitude towards life didn't change. However, he always cared deeply for my niece. When I last saw my sister-in-law, she looked more flamboyant, while my niece had drastically changed. Still growing, she was emaciated, with a large gauze covering her entire eye and visible scars on her arms. She constantly seemed in pain and concerned about her eye. Despite seeing her daughter in such a state, my sister-in-law showed no concern, sporting a self-deprecating grin. This kid, despite being a girl, is so wild. She boldly fell face first by herself. Seems like she got a twig stuck in her eye. She's in pain. Hilarious, right? I couldn't understand how she could laugh at such a situation. When I asked if they had gone to the hospital, she laughed it off as an exaggeration and forcefully changed the subject. Look after her for a while. I've finally moved nearby, so I'm hoping you guys can help out a bit, she said, but it's tough to just take her on the spot, and I told her to wait until I could check with my husband. However, my sister-in-law didn't listen at all and forcefully left her with us before leaving. I felt indignant at my sister-in-law's selfish behavior, but I was more concerned about my niece's injuries. I thought it best to get her seen at a hospital as soon as possible, so I gave up chasing after my sister-in-law. While heading to the hospital in a taxi, I briefly explained the situation to my husband. At the hospital, the doctor said her cuts and bruises would heal naturally, but her eye was another story. Too much time had passed since the injury, and she would likely lose most of her sight, possibly all of it, due to a condition called sympathetic ophthalmia. There was a high risk she might lose sight in the other eye as well. It was heartbreaking to think such a young child would have to bear the burden of blindness. At the hospital, I hugged my trembling niece, who looked so anxious among strangers. When my husband came home that day, I told him everything. Even though we tried to contact my sister-in-law, she wouldn't answer her phone, and then it went dead. We couldn't afford to wait for her approval for my niece's treatment, so my husband and I decided to proceed on our own. 3 days after losing contact, we filed a missing person report with the police. However, they said they couldn't search just for my sister-in-law without any signs of foul play. Occasionally, when unidentified bodies were found, we were contacted if they were women around my sister-in-law's age, but none were her. By the time 2 years had passed since my sister-in-law disappeared, my husband and I were treating and raising my niece as our own daughter. As a child through high school, I had taken piano lessons seriously. Initially, it was just a hobby, but when I had to accompany my school choir, I felt I had to give it my all, so I wouldn't let my classmates down, which led me to take piano more seriously. However, I wasn't skilled enough to become a professional performer. At best, I'd be a beginner's piano teacher. I continued playing as a hobby in college, and my niece became interested in the sound of my piano and started playing. She wasn't perfect pitch, but she could remember and play songs with proper expression after hearing them a few times. When I began teaching her piano, her talent quickly blossomed. She progressed rapidly, interpreting pieces in her way and even composing her music. She wanted more people to hear her play, so I suggested we post videos online. At the time, videos of street performances were popular, so we thought it might get some views if we followed that trend. Our plan was a hit, and she gained attention as a blind pianist. Around that time, as we were concerned about my niece's future, we were relieved to think she could make a living from her talent. Although my husband and I had planned to save enough money so she wouldn't struggle financially when alone, that money wasn't unlimited. We were just hoping to create an environment where she could work and not struggle to live, even if it was minimal. If she could make a living playing the piano she loved, nothing could be better. We started receiving inquiries from TV stations for appearances and permissions for secondary use of her videos. When one TV station got permission to use a video, it quickly became known nationwide. Just as negotiations for appearances from other networks began and record companies started proposing CD releases, my sister-in-law, who had been missing, suddenly reappeared. She had been sitting in front of our house, seemingly waiting for us to come out. While my husband and I were in shock, my sister-in-law hugged my niece, apologizing for not being able to come get her due to circumstances, while tears welled up in her eyes. She said she never forgot about her niece and was surprised but relieved to see her growing up on TV, saying things a mother would say. When my husband asked her where she had been and what she had been doing, she retorted that there was no need to tell him. Ignoring my husband, she reached out to my niece. "So, Sophia, I'm in a bit of a bind, especially financially, so, could you support me? I raised you after your father and I split up, so think of it as returning the favor." My husband, infuriated that it all came down to money, drove my sister-in-law away. However, undeterred, my sister-in-law kept coming back to see my niece. When my husband was around, he could always send her away, but when it was just my niece and me, she was persistent and wouldn't leave, forcing us to listen to her tales of hardship. She intended to work and leave my niece with us, but her company went bankrupt, and she hadn't been paid for days, going without food or drink. She claimed at times she was forced to live on the streets, had saved up money to come get my niece but was swindled out of it all. Now, she's being targeted by dangerous debt collectors. She pleaded for us to lend her money just for this month's payment as her life was in danger. My husband and I rejected her claims as she brought it upon herself, but as my niece listened to her story, she seemed to grow sympathetic and declared she would go with her aunt. Furthermore, she even offered to cover this month's debt for her. I felt incredibly sad, realizing that a real mother's bond is hard to compete with. No matter how much we worried and loved her, we couldn't match her neglectful biological mother. Yet, it seemed my niece had always dreamed of living with her mother. With that in mind, I couldn't stop her decision. I told my niece she could always rely on us if things got tough. This house is still her home, and she can come back whenever she wants. She thanked me and left with her aunt. I hoped her aunt would change her ways and make up for the lost time by making my niece happy. However, seeing the triumphant smile on my sister-in-law's face only increased my worries. But 4 days later, my sister-in-law returned with my niece, her face bruised. "How can you live with such a barbaric kid?" she yelled the moment she saw me. What did she mean my niece was barbaric? It was hard to imagine my blind niece doing something to her. But I had some suspicions. "You didn't, by any chance, grab her from behind without saying anything, did you?" Even for someone who can see, it's frightening to be grabbed suddenly from behind. For my niece, who can't see, not being able to tell who it is would probably make her resist desperately. "So what if I did? I'm her mother. And this barbarian pushed me away." There it was, she had done it. It seems that wasn't all. My sister-in-law had tapped my niece on the shoulder and grabbed her arm without speaking first. My niece could sense people around her to some extent, even though she can't see. But always having to be alert, she's vulnerable in places she feels safe, like at home. Touching her carelessly in such states was bound to startle her into resisting. I was concerned for my niece, who must have been frightened. "Why do you feel sorry for that barbarian? It's ridiculous. You should be concerned about me." My sister-in-law had done that on the first day, apparently hitting her body against the wall. Undeterred, she did the same the next day, falling and bruising her face. The following day she did it again, hitting the corner of a table and adding to her bruises and injuries. "I taught you what to be careful of when living with my blind niece. Why didn't you heed that? Stop nagging. I'm the only one in the house, why should I have to watch over my own child?" My sister-in-law then started ranting nonsensically about how my niece was violent towards her because she resented her. My husband, outraged that this was going nowhere, said people like her are not suited to live with someone who is visually impaired and kicked her out of the house. "I'm sorry. I must have made things harder for you," I said, feeling unsure how to comfort my niece as her hopes of living with her biological mother were dashed, and I just kept apologizing. However, my niece didn't seem too hurt and smiled, saying, "I never intended to stay with her long anyway. I just wanted her to experience firsthand how hard it is to live with someone who's visually impaired." My niece thought that if her aunt, who dislikes complications, experienced the difficulties, she'd give up quickly. That she lasted 4 days was a miracle, probably because she was so desperate for money. In the end, my sister-in-law weighed money against freedom and chose freedom. "I don't think that persistent person will bother us anymore. The only parents I have are you and Dad," my niece said, then hugged my husband and me. Blood ties don't matter. We were already a family. A few days later, my niece had to travel to a regional TV station for a live performance. My husband had an important work commitment, so I went with her alone. She wasn't yet signed with any agency, so I had to act like her manager. While metropolitan TV stations might send someone to pick us up, regional ones didn't provide such thorough support. However, it was a station we had visited before, so I figured it would be manageable. The shoot wasn't in a studio, but inside a historic building where we were allowed to place a piano and broadcast her playing live. Just as we thought we were connected for the broadcast, an unexpected person barged in. "I am the biological mother of the blind pianist. My daughter was taken away by my own brother and his wife." As soon as she realized my niece was making money, my sister-in-law claimed during her absence we had forcibly taken her. Initially, the TV station wanted to cut her off, but then decided her emotional appeal might make for compelling viewing and broadcast her tearful plea. We were portrayed in a negative light. But I couldn't stand her using my niece as a pawn. "Stop making reckless accusations," I said as I tried to pull her away from the camera. However, she resisted. "This evil woman has stolen my beloved daughter. Police, are you watching? Arrest her." some of the TV staff, despite their orders, started questioning whether it was right to air this. What are security doing? Voices were raised about how an unrelated person was allowed inside. Then, my niece slowly stood up, taking control of the situation, and raised her voice. What this woman is saying is a lie. I will tell you the truth. Where is the camera that's filming me? When the cameraman indicated where he was, my niece turned towards the sound and confessed our complex relationship. When I was a child, I suffered a severe injury to my face. The most significant damage was to my eye. The reason I am blind is that the woman claiming to be my biological mother did not take me to the hospital. She also talked about how my sister-in-law had left her at our house, prioritizing her freedom, and then disappeared, leading us to live as a family. She learned piano from me, and she credited that for her success today. Unlike my sister-in-law, who became emotional, my niece spoke calmly and clearly, making it obvious whose claims were truthful. After she started appearing on TV, the long-lost sister-in-law showed up out of the blue, clearly just for money. My niece tried living with her, but her aunt was completely incapable of dealing with a visually impaired person and acted selfishly. At the same time, my husband, watching the broadcast from his workplace, learned that a man claiming to be my niece's uncle was explaining the same story to the TV station's headquarters by phone, further disproving my sister-in-law's claims. The on-site manager had my sister-in-law detained by security, and then the staff called the police, resulting in an interrogation. Although the live broadcast was interrupted, my niece performed bravely and flawlessly. I heard that the TV station's phone lines were inundated afterward. From complaints about my sister-in-law to messages of support for my niece, the feedback varied. The incident also spread on social media, resulting in some of the highest ratings and replay counts the station had ever seen. We planned to go home right after the broadcast, but due to the incident with my sister-in-law's intrusion, the police wanted to speak with us, so we stayed overnight at a hotel. Given the circumstances, my husband entrusted his work to a reliable colleague and came to join us. That evening, the police came to our hotel to hear my sister-in-law's side. She reportedly told them she had accumulated significant debt by financially supporting a man, planning to use public sympathy to extract alimony from us. My sister-in-law had targeted the moment I was away from my husband, following my niece and me. Today, while my niece and I were at the regional TV station and my husband was at work. Our separate activities, especially since it was an on-location shoot, made it easy for her to enter, posing as staff without suspicion. She told us that because many people come and go, and she claimed to be staff, no one suspected her and she could easily get inside. The TV station later apologized to us. The director who broadcasted her claims live ended up being demoted. The backlash was so significant that they had to take such action, as ignoring the volume of complaints wasn't an option. Of course, the encouragement for my niece was overwhelming, but the complaints were too loud to ignore. My husband listened silently as the police spoke and as the TV station apologized. Once they left and it was just our family, he reflected on my sister-in-law's past. My sister has always loved the limelight and depended too much on men. Dependency would be one thing, but her recklessness and inability to be faithful often led her into conflicts with men. When she was in high school, besides her boyfriend, she apparently tasted others out of curiosity, which once led to an assault incident. We thought she had settled down after marrying my niece's father, but it turned out she hadn't changed. My husband speculated that it wasn't really irreconcilable differences, as claimed, but rather her infidelity that drove my niece's father away. Disgusted beyond words, he decisively cut ties with her. The incident with my sister-in-law crashing the broadcast was covered first by local news and then by national television. On social media, self-proclaimed justice warriors researched and spread her history. Whether that was right or wrong, for our family, it meant she couldn't easily walk around outside anymore, for which we were grateful. It seemed unlikely she would stalk my niece anytime soon. She had apparently borrowed money from many people. And since the broadcast revealed her location, she found herself in quite a predicament. Some who were looking for her spotted her being chased by suspicious individuals during a live stream by a content creator looking for views. This became a hot topic, which I also saw. Some posts on social media even offered a bounty for capturing my sister-in-law, presenting it as a high-paying gig, showing how desperate the situation had become. While there was no immediate danger to us or my niece, we couldn't rule out debt collectors using my niece to get to her, so we prioritized her safety and decided to move. This also led to my niece signing with a talent agency, which arranged for a manager, assistants, and security to accompany her. Additionally, we hired private security to guard her even when she wasn't working. Although having someone always around might seem uncomfortable, my niece surprisingly found it reassuring. She soon has a solo performance at one of the nation's top music halls. Our wish is for her to always be happy, but for now, we are focused on praying for the success of her upcoming concert.